The folks in Brookvale Ridge always said our house smelled like cinnamon and morality. They couldn't smell the scent of old ash ground into the fireplace grout. That night, when my stepmother's hand cracked across my face, my father stared at the fire and simply left the room. 5 minutes later, I was the one who burned the whole thing down. With the truth, my name is Katie Hoffman, I am 30 years old, and I am an expert in the precise architecture of silence. Tonight, that silence had a scent. It smelled of dying pine boughs from the winter charity gala garlands, the sour sweet dregs of champagne and 200 abandoned flutes, and the suffocatingly expensive French perfume clinging to my stepmother's clothes. The last of the donors, their wallets lighter and their consciences temporarily polished, had finally driven their German sedans down our icy driveway here in Brookvale Ridge, the great hall of the Hoffman mansion, buzzing for 6 hours with forced laughter and the clinking of mutual back-scratching, was finally, dreadfully, quiet. Elaine Hoffman, my father's wife, stood by the grand staircase, her spine as straight and cold as the marble beneath her feet. She was beautiful, in the way a perfect, lethal icicle is beautiful. Tonight, she had been a triumph. She'd glided through the rooms, a vision in emerald silk, her voice a warm balm of concern as she collected checks for the Hoffman Foundation. I saw her earlier, cornering the new city councilman. "We must do more for the underprivileged," she'd murmured, her hand grazing his arm. Then she'd glanced at me, standing alone by the catering table, and her voice had carried just enough. "It's such a passion for me, especially since dear Katie's difficulties. Mental wellness is so fragile, isn't it?" The councilman had nodded gravely, his eyes flicking to me with a new, uncomfortable pity. He didn't know, of course, that her version of my difficulties was a carefully edited narrative of my professional life, designed to paint me as unstable. I watched her hand, the one not holding a champagne flute, as she spoke, the heavy pearl ring on her right finger twisted. Once, twice, it was her tell, the small, unconscious motion that accompanied every one of her magnificent lies. Now, with the last door closed, the mask of the philanthropist dissolved. Her shoulders didn't slump. Elaine would never be so unrefined. Instead, they tensed. She turned to me, the smile gone, her eyes flat and hard as slate. "Well," she said, her voice, stripped of its public honey, was a dry rasp. "You certainly did your best to look miserable, didn't you?" I didn't reply. I had learned, painfully and over many years, that words were useless. They were just ammunition she would twist and fire back. I kept my gaze level, focusing on the intricate pearl clasp of her necklace. "I'm talking to you, Katie. After all the work I put into this evening, you couldn't even pretend to be grateful? You stood in that corner like a ghost, making everyone uncomfortable. Do you have any idea how that reflects on me? On this family?" "I helped with the auction list," I said, my voice barely a whisper, but it sounded too loud in the cavernous room. "The auction list," she scoffed, taking a step closer. I could smell the wine on her breath, sharp and acidic. "That's all you're good for, isn't it? Paperwork, hiding in the background. You're a 30-year-old child living in her father's house, contributing nothing but a bad mood." "This was Mother's house," I said, and I knew I'd made a mistake before the words even finished echoing. It was a stupid, childish jab, born of pure exhaustion. Her eyes narrowed. The air between us became thin and electric. "This," she hissed, "is my house, and you will show me respect." She moved faster than I anticipated. Her hand, rings and all, cracked across my left cheek. The sound was sharp, a single, violent punctuation mark in the stillness. My head snapped back, my hair whipping into my eyes. The sting was immediate, a hot, radiating bloom of pain. I tasted copper. I didn't make a sound. I didn't flinch. I just stood there, my cheeks screaming. As she lowered her hand, she flexed her fingers, as if shaking off a cramp. The pearl ring was now slightly askew. I knew from experience this would leave a mark, a faint, yellowish-purple shadow that my thickest concealer would struggle to hide tomorrow. It would join the faint discoloration from last month, a ghostly map of her displeasure. "Now," she said, smoothing the front of her silk dress. "Go to your room. I can't bear to look at you." She turned and began to ascend the staircase, her back rigid, her head held high, the perfect hostess retiring after a flawless evening. I stood there, unmoving, for a full minute. I listened to the click of her heels on the marble, then the softer thud as they hit the antique runner on the second-floor landing. The grandfather clock by the door chimed, a deep, resonant bong that signaled it was 2 a.m. It was only then that my eyes burned. The tears came, hot and silent, blurring the grand hall into a watercolor of muted golds and dark woods. I pressed the fingers of my right hand to my throbbing cheek, a useless gesture of comfort. And that is how my father found me. Richard Hoffman appeared from the doorway of his study, a place he increasingly used as a fortress. He was still in his tuxedo, though his bow tie was undone, hanging loosely around his neck. He was a tall man, or perhaps he just seemed tall because of the weight of his silence. He looked at me. His eyes, my eyes, we had the same ones. Taking in the scene, he saw my hand on my face. He saw the tears tracking through my foundation. He saw the fresh, angry red welt that was already darkening. He said nothing. There was a long, terrible pause where the only sounds were the ticking clock and the dying crackle of the fire in the massive stone fireplace across the room. I looked at him, my heart hammering a desperate, frantic plea against my ribs. "Say something. Say anything. Tell her she's wrong. Tell me I'm not crazy. Tell me you see me." My father held my gaze for 3 seconds, then he blinked, a slow, deliberate motion. He looked away from my face and fixed his stare on the dancing flames in the hearth. His jaw tightened, just slightly, the only sign of any emotion he ever allowed himself. Then, without a single word, he turned his back on me and walked out of the room. The sound of his study door clicking shut, a soft, oily thud, was louder than the slap. The pain in my cheek was nothing. It was a firefly next to the sun. The real injury, the one that went straight to the bone, was his silence, his retreat, his complete and utter abdication. The slap was Elaine's anger. His departure was my condemnation. It confirmed everything she said. I was not worth defending. I was not worth the trouble. I was nothing. I sank down onto the bottom step of the staircase, the cold of the marble seeping through my thin dress. My mind flashed, unwanted, to a conference room, fluorescent lights, bad coffee, and the smell of industrial cleaner. Silverline Industries. I had been a senior safety compliance officer. I was good at it. I saw patterns. I found the cracks in the system before they became disasters. I found one, a big one, faulty wiring on a new production line, a supplier who was cutting corners, a supervisor who was signing off on it, and a paper trail that led straight up to the executive floor. I wrote the report. I documented everything, just as I had been trained. I followed the protocol. And the system closed ranks. The internal investigation, led by a man I'd seen playing golf with the COO, concluded I had misinterpreted the data, that I was overly zealous and not a team player. My meticulous report was buried. I was offered a generous severance package, contingent on a non-disclosure agreement so thick it would stop a bullet. I was 28 years old, and my career was over before it began. Elaine had feasted on it. Poor Katie, she'd sighed to her friends, twisting that pearl ring. She had a complete nervous breakdown, just couldn't handle the pressure. She's fragile, you know. The narrative stuck. I was no longer a whistleblower. I was the unstable daughter, the family liability, and my father, the CEO of Hoffman Holdings, a man who built an empire on supposed integrity, had allowed it. He had watched that, too, and said nothing. I wiped my face, my hand coming away streaked with makeup and tears. The fire crackled again, drawing my attention. My father was back. He had entered the room so quietly I hadn't noticed. He wasn't looking at me. He was standing by the fireplace, his back to me. He held a crumpled linen napkin from the gala. He did something at the mantel, a small, precise movement, and then, as silently as he had arrived, he was gone again, back to his study. I stood up, my legs stiff. What was that? I walked over to the fireplace. The heat from the embers washed over my face, stinging my cold, wet skin. There, on the heavy oak mantel, sat the napkin. It was stained with soot, a dark, greasy smear of chimney ash. It was placed deliberately, not just tossed aside. I picked it up. The linen was heavy, expensive. The ash was gritty under my fingertips. There was nothing inside it. It was just a dirty napkin. But he had placed it. He had seen my face, left the room, and returned to place this specific, soiled thing on the mantel before leaving again. It was a message. I didn't know what it meant, but it was the first thing he had said to me in years. I folded the napkin carefully and slid it into the small pocket of my dress. My fingers closed around it. It felt like a stone, a secret. I looked up, my gaze catching on the antique, gold-leaf mirror that hung above the fireplace. My reflection stared back. A 30-year-old woman with smeared mascara, a blossoming bruise, and haunted eyes. The ghost at the party, the fragile daughter. But as I looked, something else stared back. The woman in the mirror was not just a victim. She was the woman who had read blueprints. She was the woman who had cross-referenced shipping manifests with safety codes. She was the woman who had been right about Silverline. I would not cry by this fireplace ever again. I stared at my own reflection, my hand still clutching the ashy napkin in my pocket. My father's silence was a void, but this napkin was a thing. It was tangible. It was a clue. A log in the fireplace collapsed, sending a shower of bright orange sparks up the chimney. The flames leaped high for a second, illuminating the room in a wild, flickering dance. At the same moment, the grand chandelier overhead dimmed, the bulbs buzzing and flickering, just for a second. A small cascade of fine gray ash sifted down from the chimney, landing silently on the hearthstone. It was as if the house, having held its breath all night, had finally, deeply, exhaled, as if something in the walls was listening, waiting. The next morning, the sun rose on a world scrubbed clean of last night's drama. Snow had fallen, blanketing Brookvale Ridge in a heavy, sound-dampening white. It was as if the very air was complicit in the house's code of silence. I came downstairs at 9 o'clock, having spent hours meticulously applying concealer to my cheek. The bruise was a masterpiece of purple and yellow, ugly and insistent. Now, under layers of foundation, it was just a dull, puffy shadow. Elaine was in the breakfast nook, bathed in the sharp winter light. She was wearing a cream-colored cashmere set and reading the Financial Times. A plate of perfectly scrambled eggs and smoked salmon sat untouched in front of her. She looked up as I entered, her face a mask of serene, domestic warmth. "Good morning, darling," she chirped, as if I were a favorite niece, not a target. "Sleep well?" Lorna made coffee. I poured myself a cup, my hand steady. The smell of the rich, dark roast was almost offensive in its normality. "Good morning. Elaine?" She smiled, folded the newspaper, and gestured to the chair opposite her. Sit. We barely saw you last night." I sat, the silence stretched, punctuated only by the ticking of the carriage clock on the mantel. I waited. She picked up her fork, took a dainty bite of salmon, and chewed thoughtfully. "Such a successful evening," she mused, more to the room than to me. Margaret Ellison was so impressed with the turnout. She said we'd likely raised over $300,000 for the fund. She paused, her eyes finally landing on me, sharp and assessing. They flicked to my cheek, lingered for a fraction of a second, and then moved on, finding nothing of interest. She saw the makeup, of course. She knew exactly what it was hiding. Her lack of comment was the comment. My father entered, and the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. He was already dressed for the office, his gray suit a kind of armor. He went straight for the coffee, keeping his back to us both. "Richard, darling, sit with us," Elaine cooed. He took his cup, black, and turned. His eyes skated over me, refusing to land. He looked at the wall just past my left ear. "Can't. Have an early meeting." He cleared his throat. "Katie, did you call about the car maintenance?" The brakes on the sedan felt soft. My heart did a strange, painful lurch. Car maintenance? That was what he had. After last night, a question about a vehicle. It was so mundane, so dismissive. It was almost a fresh assault. "I'll look at it today," I said, my voice flat. He nodded, satisfied. Good. He headed for the door, then paused, his hand on the knob. "Elaine, I've asked Dylan to stop by. He needs to sign those proxy forms before the board meeting." Elaine's smile tightened, just barely. "Of course, dear. I'll be announcing the meeting this week. Just a bit of routine. Asset restructuring." Richard nodded again, a sharp, bird-like motion, and was gone. The front door clicked shut, as final as his study door had been hours earlier. Asset restructuring. The words hung in the air, cold and heavy. "Yes," Elaine said, picking up her fork again. "It's time to trim the fat at Hoffman Holdings. Streamline. My father always said a business, like a garden, needs aggressive pruning to thrive." She looked directly at me, her smile bright and empty. "Don't you agree, Katie?" I just sipped my coffee. It was scalding, but I didn't let myself react. An hour later, I was in the library, pretending to read. The sooty napkin was in my pocket, a heavy, tangible secret. I was waiting. For what? I wasn't sure. My cousin, Dylan Marks, arrived just before 11. Dylan was a nervous, perpetually apologetic man who worked in the accounting department at Hoffman Holdings, a position Elaine had graciously secured for him. He owed her, and she never let him forget it. He saw me in the library doorway and jumped. "Oh, Katie. Hi. Didn't see you there. Just here to drop these off for Elaine." He waved a manila envelope, his eyes darting around the hall as if expecting to be reprimanded. "She's in the conservatory, on a call," I said. His relief was palpable. He edged closer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Katie, listen, I shouldn't be saying this. I really shouldn't." "Say what, Dylan?" It's Elaine." He licked his lips, his gaze flicking to the conservatory door. "This asset restructuring, it's not routine. She's moving money. Katie, a lot of it, out of the family fund." This wasn't new, precisely, but the confirmation made my blood run cold. "Where?" "I don't know exactly, but I overheard her on the phone with Victor Hale. Something about antique gold, coins. I think she said it was a discreet investment. She had me wire transfer $200,000 to an account I'd never seen before, some trust in Delaware." He ran a hand through his thinning hair. When I asked about the paperwork, she just smiled and said it was all being handled. "Katie, she's pulling money out, and I don't think your father knows the details." My first instinct was to doubt him. Dylan was weak, but he was also meticulous. He was a numbers guy. "Why are you telling me?" "Because she's using my signature on the wire forms," he hissed, his panic rising. "She said it was a test of loyalty. If your father finds out, Katie, I could go to jail." "Then you stop signing," I said, my voice harder than I intended. "You don't get it. She'll ruin me. She'll tell your father I'm incompetent. She'll just be careful. This board meeting, she's trying to consolidate power. That's what the proxies are for." Elaine's voice, bright and false, echoed from the hall. "Dylan, darling, there you are." Dylan flinched as if struck. "Got to go," he muttered, and he scrambled away, leaving me in the shadows of the library, the smell of old books and fresh fear thick in my throat. I needed air. I needed to think. I went to the great hall, the scene of last night's humiliation. It was bright with sunlight now, the fireplace cold and clean. Lorna, our housekeeper, was there, dusting the mantel. Lorna had been with my father since before my mother died. She was a quiet, watchful woman, with eyes that missed nothing and a loyalty I'd never been able to parse. She moved with a silent efficiency, a ghost in a gray uniform. As I approached, she stopped dusting and turned to me. Her gaze was kind, but searching. Her eyes, like Elaine's, lingered on my cheek. Unlike Elaine, her expression softened with something that looked like pity. "Miss Katie," she said, her voice a low murmur. She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled something out. "This was on the hearthstone this morning. Must have fallen." She pressed a small, ornate brass key into my palm. It was old, the kind for a jewelry box or a small lockbox. It was warm from her hand. "It wasn't there when I cleaned last night," she added, her eyes meeting mine. "Not until after the fire was out. It was right by the edge, near the loose stone." My fingers closed around the key. "Thank you, Lorna." "Be careful, child," she whispered, so softly I barely heard it. Then she turned and, with her silent tread, was gone. I stood there, the key a heavy weight in my hand. I went to my father's study. The door unlocked as he was gone. I tried the key on the antique desk drawers. It didn't fit. I tried it on the locked tantalus on the sideboard. Too small. I tried it on the small inlay box where he kept his cufflinks. Nothing. I slipped the key into my pocket, next to the ashy napkin. I went back to the fireplace. I knelt on the cold stone hearth, my eyes scanning the area Lorna had indicated. The loose stone. There, to the right of the grate. One of the sandstone bricks looked just like the others, but when I pressed it, it felt different. The mortar around it was not mortar. It was a hairline crack, a seam. It was exactly where my father had stood. It was exactly where he had placed the napkin. I ran my fingernail along the crack. The stone was solid. It didn't budge, but it was different. I was a compliance officer. I was trained to see the anomalies, the tiny deviations from the norm that signal a systemic failure. This was an anomaly. I stood up, my mind racing. A key, a cracked brick, an ashy napkin, car maintenance. I looked up and my breath caught. Across the hall, near the main staircase, was a large, gilt-framed mirror. In its reflection, I could see the entire hall, and just for a second, I saw my father. He wasn't at the office. He was standing in the doorway of the dining room, deep in the shadows, watching me. He had been there the whole time. He had watched me try the key. He had watched me find the brick. Our eyes met in the reflection. I didn't move. My hand was still on the cracked stone. He didn't smile. His face was unreadable, a mask of aristocratic stillness. But then, slowly, deliberately, he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. And he was gone, vanished back into the shadows of the house. A cold electric shock went through me. It wasn't a message of comfort. It wasn't an apology. It was a confirmation. It was a command. You are on the right path. Keep going. Not now, he had said to me. Not because he wouldn't help, because it wasn't the time. The rest of the day passed in a thick, oppressive haze. I felt like I was moving underwater, every action requiring immense, silent effort. At dinner, which was a tense, silent affair of roast chicken and overboiled vegetables, Elaine announced her new plan. "I was thinking," she said, dabbing her lips with a linen napkin. A clean one. This time. "We haven't had a proper family portrait in ages. Not since, well, it's been too long." My father just grunted, pushing a carrot around his plate. "I called Philip," she continued, referring to her pet photographer. "He's free this evening. Miraculously, I thought, right here, in the great hall, by the fireplace, to capture the memory. Won't that be lovely?" It was a command, not a request. At 8 o'clock, we were assembled. Philip, a man with a fawning demeanor and a camera lens worth more than my car, was setting up lights. "Wonderful, Elaine, just wonderful," he gushed. "Now, Richard, if you could stand here, and Katie, lovely, right next to your father." I was wearing a black dress, the only color I felt appropriate. Elaine was in a silvery blue sheath that caught the light. her pearl ring gleaming. She had draped her arm through my father's, her smile fixed and brilliant. "Just a family moment," she said to Philip, loud enough for me to hear. "So important to preserve these memories. Life is so fleeting." I stood beside my father, our shoulders almost touching, but a mile apart. The lights were hot. My cheek, under its mask of makeup, throbbed. I felt the familiar, cold dread of being trapped, of being part of her performance. But this time, something was different. I thought of the key in my pocket. I thought of the cracked brick. I thought of my father's nod in the mirror. I slipped my hand into my dress pocket and pulled out my phone, shielding the motion with my body. I opened the audio recording app and pressed the red button. I set the phone on the edge of the mantel, just behind a pewter vase, the microphone facing out. "All right, everyone," Philip trilled. "Big smiles. Think of charity." I arranged my face into a semblance of a smile. My father looked stoic. Elaine looked radiant. Flash. The light was blinding. "Lovely again." Flash. As the light burst, filling the room with a temporary artificial sun. Elaine leaned her head toward me, her smile never wavering, her teeth gleaming, her perfume, heavy and sweet, washed over me. She didn't move her lips enough for the photographer to notice, her voice a venomous whisper, meant only for me, lost in the click and whir of the camera. "Smile, Katie," she hissed, the sound a razor blade under the velvet. "Or you'll lose your share." Flash. I smiled, and in the reflection of the dark camera lens, I saw my own eyes. They weren't afraid. They were analyzing. They were recording. I waited until I heard the faint, heavy sound of the master bedroom door closing, 2 floors above me. I waited another hour, until the old house settled into its deep night silence, a silence punctuated only by the groan of old wood and the ticking of the grandfather clock. It was nearly 3 a.m. I had retrieved my phone from the mantelpiece as soon as the photographer left. Elaine had been too busy accepting his fawning compliments to notice. I'd listened to the recording in the pantry. Her voice was there, sharp and clear beneath the flash and click of the camera. "Smile, Katie, or you'll lose your share." I saved the file. It was a start, but it wasn't the weapon. The real weapon, I knew, was still in the wall. I went back to the great hall, my bare feet silent on the cold oak floor. I knelt on the hearth, the stone chilling my knees. I took the small brass key from my pocket. It felt heavy, important. My fingers found the hairline crack around the sandstone brick, exactly where Lorna had indicated. It was just as I had found it earlier, a perfect seam of shadow. I pushed. Nothing. I pushed harder, bracing my shoulder against the mantel. Still nothing. I stopped. I wasn't an engineer, but I was a compliance officer. I didn't look at the problem. I looked at the system. This wasn't designed for brute force. It was designed for a specific action. I thought of my father. His movements were precise, deliberate. I didn't just push. I pressed on the bottom left corner, applying steady pressure, while simultaneously trying to slide the brick inward. A dry grinding sound, like a throat being cleared, echoed in the hall. The brick didn't move. It tilted. It was on a pivot. The top edge receded into the darkness of the wall, revealing a small black void. My heart was hammering. I angled my phone's flashlight into the opening. Deep inside the masonry, I saw it, a small, dark metal keyhole, set into what looked like a plate. It was invisible from any normal angle. My hand was shaking. I slid the brass key into the hole. It was a perfect fit. I turned it. There was no click, but a soft, oily snick of well-maintained tumblers aligning. I heard a weight shift, a heavy clunk deep inside the chimney structure. I pulled, and the brick, along with a heavy 6-inch square steel box it was attached to, slid out smoothly from the wall. It was a hidden safe, disguised as a piece of the fireplace. I carried the box to the study. It was surprisingly heavy. It wasn't locked. The keyhole in the wall had been the only lock. I opened the lid. The contents were sparse. There was no gold, no cash, just 2 items. The first was a standard, old-fashioned cassette tape, the kind we used in the 90s. On the white adhesive label, in my father's precise, architectural handwriting, were 2 words, Autumn Flame. The second item was a single piece of his heavy monogrammed stationery, folded in half. I opened it. The note was short. His script was as steady as ever. If I walk away, it's to pull you forward. Trust the fireplace. I stared at the words until they blurred. If I walk away. Last night, in the hall, 2 years ago, at Silverline, all the times his silence had felt like a betrayal. A cold, hard wall. He was telling me it was a strategy, a way to pull me forward, not to push me away. He was telling me to stop being the victim and start being the investigator. I had the evidence. Now I had the motive. What I didn't have was a cassette player. The next morning, I drove into town, avoiding the roads Elaine usually took. The Brookvale History Club was housed in the damp, musty basement of the town hall. Mrs. Prentice, the volunteer curator, was overjoyed to see a Hoffman. "Katie, dear," she bustled, smelling of lavender and old paper. "What an unexpected pleasure." "Mrs. Prentice," I said, manufacturing the warmest smile I could manage. "I have a small project. I was hoping to digitize some of the old recordings of the town's Christmas pageant, the one from 1995. I think my mother was in it. I heard you had the only working deck in town." Her face lit up. "Oh, the pageant. Such memories. Yes, we have the Tascam. It's a bit theatrical, but it's a professional deck. Right this way. It's for the town archives. You understand?" "Of course," I said. "I'm just digitizing, preserving the memory." I walked out with a heavy, professional-grade cassette deck in a carrying case. I didn't go home. I went to the public library, found a study carrel in the deepest, quietest corner of the nonfiction stacks, and plugged in the machine. I put on the bulky headphones, slid the tape labeled Autumn Flame into the deck, and pressed the play button. The tape hissed for 3 seconds, then a voice. "It has to be done. Victor, I don't care what he thinks." Elaine, but this wasn't the public, honey-smooth voice. This was cold, flat, and impatient. "Elaine," a man's voice answered, rich, smooth, and familiar. "Victor Hale, our family lawyer for 30 years. What you're suggesting is not just unethical, it's precarious. If Richard ever challenges this—" "He can't," she snapped. "He just had a transient ischemic attack, a stroke. Victor, the doctor said he's lucky to be walking. He's weak. He's suggestible. His signature is a mess. We present this as a simplification of the estate. We amend the durable power of attorney, full financial control, now, while he's confused." My hand flew to my mouth. A stroke. My father. I frantically searched my memory. About 6 months ago, he'd gone to a spa in Arizona, according to Elaine. For his blood pressure, he'd been gone for 2 weeks. It wasn't a spa. It was a hospital. On the tape, Victor sounded nervous. "The current POA splits control. 50% to you as his wife, 50% to Katie, in trust." "That is the problem." Elaine's voice was a low growl. "That girl, she sits in this house, watching. She's a liability. We move her share into the main trust, under my management. We cite her mental instability, the Silverline incident. It's a clean narrative. She's not fit to manage a trust. By the time he's fully recovered, it will be done." The silence on the tape was thick. I could hear the expensive hum of the air filter in my father's study. Then, another sound, a door opening, the slow, heavy drag of a slippered foot. "What?" my father's voice said. It was slurred, thick, devastatingly tired. A sharp intake of breath from Elaine. "Richard, darling, you're supposed to be in bed." "Heard voices," my father said. Each word was an effort. "What are you doing, Victor?" "Richard," Victor said, his voice instantly becoming a smooth balm. "We're just reviewing some quarterly reports. You shouldn't be up." "You touched my desk," Richard said. The POA. I see it. A pause, then his voice, suddenly stronger, colder, and full of a menace I had never heard. Elaine, if you touch it again, I will open the fireplace. A stunned silence. Elaine laughed, a brittle, ugly sound. What? Richard, you're delirious. The medication is making you… Open the fireplace? What does that even mean? You're talking nonsense. You know exactly what it means. My father's voice cut through her. I will open the fireplace. I will open everything, all of it, from the beginning. Now, get out. Both of you. Get out of my study. The tape clicked, hissed, went silent. I rewound it, listened again. I will open the fireplace. It wasn't a threat. It was a code, a countersign. He was telling her he had an insurance policy, and he had hidden it in the walls. Autumn Flame. Not a song title. It was the time of year. Autumn, when the fires were lit, when he'd had the stroke. I fast-forwarded the tape, listening for anything else. Near the very end, after minutes of blank air, there was another sound, a brief recording, clearly made in the same room, but different. It was the sound of scraping, a clink, and then a small, metallic clatter as something small and light hit the stone hearth. It was the key. He had recorded the sound of himself hiding the key. I sat back, the headphones heavy on my head. This changed everything. My father wasn't weak. He was playing a long game. He had been attacked, from within his own home, and he had laid a trap. I took off the headphones, my mind no longer a daughter's, but a compliance officer's, my brain from Silverline, the one that saw patterns and documented breaches, clicked into place. Data point 1. Elaine attempted to seize financial control by faking instability and leveraging his stroke. Data point 2. Victor Hale, the family lawyer, is a co-conspirator. Data point 3. My father stopped them, but it cost him. He's been pretending to be weaker than he is ever since. Data point 4. The fireplace is the key, and this tape is only the first part. I will open everything, he'd said. I listened to the tape one last time, but not for the words. I was listening to the room. I counted the steps. Richard's footsteps. 7. From the door to the desk. The sound of the chair. The slight echo from the window where Victor was standing. I was creating a schematic, a map of the betrayal. I packed the Tascom deck. I returned it to Mrs. Prentice, telling her that digitizing was a success, but I'd need to check the audio levels back home. She waved me off, happy to have her artifact back. I drove home with the tape in my pocket, next to the ashy napkin and the brass key. I was no longer the girl crying by the fire. I was the one who knew how to open it. I spent the next 48 hours in a state of hyper-alertness, a feeling I hadn't experienced since my last days at Silverline Industries. The memory rose up, sharp and unwelcome, as I sat in the library, pretending to read a biography of some railroad baron. I was in a conference room, gray carpet, gray walls, gray faces, my report, the one detailing the faulty wiring, the falsified safety checks, and the subcontractor kickbacks, sat in the middle of the table. My boss, a man named Mark, pushed a new, thinner report toward me. "Katie, this is the final version," he'd said, his voice oozing false sympathy. "It's a simple addendum. It states that your initial findings were preliminary, and that subsequent tests found the wiring to be within acceptable variance." "Acceptable variance?" I'd said, my voice shaking just slightly. "Mark, it's a fire hazard. The insulation is rated for half the load. It's not variance, it's fraud." He'd sighed, leaning back. "You're not a team player, Katie. You're causing panic over a rounding error. Just sign, we all sign, we move on, we get the product to market." I looked at the signature line, my name, my professional integrity. I looked at their faces, bored, impatient, complicit. "No," I'd said. The isolation was immediate. I was uninvited from meetings. My emails went unanswered. 2 weeks later, my position was made redundant during a restructuring. The non-disclosure agreement they'd had me sign on my first day, a standard boilerplate, was wielded like a club to ensure I never spoke of the proprietary information I'd seen. I left with a small severance check and a reputation for being difficult. I closed the book in my lap. I had been isolated for telling the truth. I had been called fragile for being meticulous. Elaine had used my integrity as a weapon against me, painting my refusal to comply as a mental breakdown. But now, I was applying that same meticulous, legal investigation to my own family. And this time, I wasn't just finding a rounding error, I was finding the systematic rot. My first move was practical. I needed data. Elaine's entire life was run from her digital calendar. I had guessed her password years ago. It was the name of the designer who made her wedding dress. I logged into her account from the library's desktop. It was all there. A meticulously curated schedule of power, luncheons, salon appointments, board meetings, and then I saw the patterns. Recurring appointments, twice a week, with V.H. Victor Hale, of course, but there were others. 2 entries in the last month that caught my eye. Consultation, Northgate Trust, that was the Delaware account Dylan had mentioned, and appraisal, Gallery West Auctions, that wasn't a charity, that was a high-end auction house specializing in rare antiquities. Dylan found me later that day, hovering near the kitchen, looking pale. "Katie," he whispered, pulling me into the pantry. "She wants me to sign another one, 100,000 this time. She said if I keep showing good team spirit, she'll recommend me for the new CFO position when she restructures." "A promotion," I said, the pieces clicking. "She's not just threatening you, she's bribing you." I think I'm in trouble," he stammered. "You are Dylan," I said, my voice cold. "But you're also a witness. Document everything, every form, every verbal order. Email yourself a summary of your conversations. Create a timeline. Do it now." I was giving him the advice I should have taken at Silverline. He looked at me, terrified, but he nodded. I found Lorna in the great hall, polishing the silver. The room was quiet. "Lorna," I said, my voice low. "That key. Thank you." She didn't look up, her hand moving in steady, rhythmic circles. "The house has many secrets, Miss Katie. Some want to stay hidden, some are just waiting." "Elaine," I said, taking a chance. "Does she use the fireplace often?" Lorna's hand paused, just for a beat. "Mrs. Hoffman, she likes a fire, but she doesn't use it for warmth." "What does she use it for?" Lorna looked up, her dark eyes meeting mine. "For burning things, small things, envelopes, the kind with the little clear windows, sometimes the kind with official seals, from the courthouse. She thinks the ash all goes up the chimney, but I'm the one who cleans the hearth. I see what's left." Envelopes from the courthouse, cease and desist letters, summons, invoices from Victor Hale. The final piece of the puzzle came that evening. It was just before dinner. I was in the hall. My father walked past, heading from his study to the dining room. Elaine was already seated, her voice audible from the hall as she complained to someone on the phone about a caterer. As my father passed me, he didn't slow down, but he angled his head just slightly, his voice a low, rough murmur that was completely lost in the echo of the hall. "Thursday, after 9. He was past me before I could even register it. Then, just as he reached the dining room door, he stopped, turned, and said in a loud, clear, stage voice, the voice of the family patriarch, "Katie, remind me to call the groundskeeper. We're completely out of rock salt for the drive. Completely out." He turned and went into the dining room. I stood there, my blood frozen. Rock salt. We were not out of rock salt. I had seen a new 50-pound bag by the garage door just that morning. It was a code, a signal to someone else who might be listening, an alibi for his real message. Thursday, after 9. He was setting a deadline. He was planning something. He was telling me to be ready. That night, I waited again. 2 a.m. The house was dead quiet. I went to the fireplace. I had the tape, I had the threats, I had the motive, but my father's note, "Trust the fireplace," and his words on the tape, "I will open everything," implied there was more. This wasn't just a safe, this was a system. I studied the fireplace. I was no longer a victim. I was a compliance officer. This was my new production line, and I was going to find its flaws. The first compartment had been opened with a key, a physical breach. But where was the second? I thought about the mechanics of a chimney, what parts moved. The flue damper, the handle to open and close the chimney, to control the flow of air. It was a heavy wrought iron lever, set into the right side of the fireplace, just inside the opening. I knelt, sticking my head and shoulders into the cold, ashy cavern. I pulled the lever. It moved smoothly. Clang. As the metal plate opened in the throat of the chimney, I pushed it. Clang. It closed. This was too simple. I ran my fingers along the lever mechanism itself. It was old, probably original to the house. I pulled it again, slowly. Halfway through its arc, I felt it, a tiny catch, a hesitation, a point of resistance that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't a simple lever. It was a two-stage mechanism. I pulled it to that midway point and stopped. Then I pushed the lever sideways, toward the back of the chimney. A deep, satisfying thud echoed from the wall to my left, from the heavy stone base of the mantel. I pulled my head out, covered in soot. I went to the left side, a solid-looking panel of ornamental limestone. I pushed it. It didn't move. I pulled. A 30-pound section of the stone facade, perfectly cut and balanced on a hidden hinge, swung open. There was a second compartment, 3 times the size of the first, and it was full. My hands were shaking as I pulled out the contents. There was no dust. This was an active file. The first thing was a large, leather-bound ledger. On the cover, embossed in faded gold, were 2 words, "Kindling Fund." I opened it. It was my father's handwriting, meticulous, pages and pages of it. It wasn't a business ledger. It was a list of every single illegal withdrawal Elaine had made from the Hoffman Charity Foundation. He had dates, he had amounts, he had account numbers, he had notes in the margins. Wire transfer, EH to VH, check written to Gallery West, donation, cash withdrawal, gala expenses. He had been tracking her for years. Beneath the ledger was a small velvet bag, not a jewelry bag, a document bag. I opened it. Inside was a single photograph, printed on glossy paper. It was a candid shot, clearly taken from a distance. At night, in it, 3 people were standing under a bright restaurant awning, laughing. Elaine, Victor Hale, and a third man, slick and expensive, whom I didn't recognize. They were toasting with champagne glasses. I turned the photo over, my father's handwriting again. La Sierra News, October 14th, 11 p.m. I didn't need to check the date. I knew it. That was the night he'd had his stroke, the night he was in a hospital bed in Arizona, while his wife and his lawyer were celebrating in a restaurant with an unknown man, an art dealer, a money launderer. This was the everything he was talking about. I didn't have much time. I had a portable, pen-sized scanner I'd bought after Silverline, a paranoid, necessary precaution. I took it from my room. I sat on the hearth for an hour, in the dead of night, the only light from my phone. I scanned every single page of the Kindling Fund ledger. I scanned the front and back of the photograph. I uploaded the encrypted files to a secure, anonymous cloud server, one that had no connection to my name. My work at Silverline had been about finding the one critical document that proved the breach. Here, I had found an entire library. When I was done, I put everything back, the photo, the ledger. I swung the stone panel shut. It clicked into place, the seam invisible. I went back into the chimney, my hands black with soot, and reset the flue damper. I put the original tape, the key, and the ashy napkin back into the first safe. I slid the brick box back in and tilted it shut. I ran my hand over the wall. It was perfect, a solid, impenetrable stone fireplace. I washed the soot off my hands and face. I looked in the mirror. My eyes were bright, hard, and clear. It was Wednesday morning. I had 24 hours until Thursday at 9. I would wait. The Laurel Club was where Brookvale Ridge's old money went to remind itself that it was, in fact, old money. The building smelled of lemon oil, expensive leather, and a century of quiet, ruthless decisions. Wednesday's meeting of the Hoffman Foundation's donor circle was held in the library, a room paneled in dark, intimidating mahogany. Elaine was at the head of the long, polished table, a queen holding court. She was dressed in a severe but flattering charcoal gray suit, her only adornment the pearl ring. She spoke of fiscal responsibility and community impact, her voice a warm, empathetic cello. My father sat at the absolute farthest end of the table, next to a wilting fern, looking more like a guest than the man whose name was on the foundation. He was silent, his hands clasped on the table in front of him, his gaze fixed on his water glass. He was playing the part of the frail, semi-retired patriarch perfectly. My role was that of the dutiful, quiet daughter. I poured coffee for the donors, a mix of bankers, old-line heiresses, and one aggressively modern tech investor. I smiled. I made appropriate, self-effacing small talk, and I listened. Elaine's energy is just marvelous, a woman in a Chanel tweed jacket whispered to me as I refilled her cup. But I must admit, this new accounting is a bit opaque. My late husband always insisted on absolute transparency. I'm sure Elaine is just streamlining, I murmured, my voice as smooth as hers. She's so focused on efficiency. Yes, well, the woman said, pursing her lips. Efficiency is one thing. This is just fast. The reports are half the length they used to be. I moved on. I spoke to Mr. Abernathy, a retired banker. So generous of you to come, Charles. Always. Katie, dear, he grunted. But I'll tell you, I've had 2 checks, donations, cashed by some trust in Delaware, not the usual Hoffman account. I asked Victor Hale about it, and he assured me it was a new subsidiary for discreet acquisitions. Seems odd, that's all. A charity shouldn't need to be that discreet. Northgate Trust. My pulse quickened. I smiled. I'm sure it's all in order. Elaine is so thorough. I watched my stepmother from across the room. She was at the peak of her performance. But then, Margaret Ellison, the chairwoman of the fund, and a woman with a reputation for slicing through nonsense, raised her hand. Elaine, a question, Margaret said, her voice cutting through the polite murmur. The operating budget, it seems to have increased by, let's see, nearly 30% this quarter. Can you walk us through the line items for consulting and acquisitions? The room went quiet. Elaine's smile didn't falter, but her right hand, resting on her leather-bound notebook, began to move. The pearl ring. She twisted it. Once, twice. Of course, Margaret, Elaine said, her voice like honey. We're simply being more aggressive in our outreach, to maximize our impact. We've had to acquire certain assets for future fundraising auctions, and as you know, expert legal consultation is pricier than ever. What assets? Margaret pressed. I'm not sure I'm comfortable approving a budget this vague. It's not our procedure. The ring was twisting faster now. 1, 2, 3. And with the rising costs, Elaine continued, smoothly changing the subject, I've been forced to look at cost-saving measures across the board. That's why I've made the difficult decision to begin the process of selling off the old wing of the Hoffman estate. The upkeep is simply astronomical. It's an unnecessary drain on our resources. A polite gasp went through the room. Selling part of the Hoffman mansion? It was a landmark. I watched my father. He had not moved, his eyes still on his water glass. But as the murmuring grew, he slowly lifted his head. He looked down the long, polished table, his gaze cutting through the 20 feet of mahogany to land directly on Elaine. His voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the room. The fireplace, he said, is the soul of the house. Elaine froze. It was not a loud statement. It was not an accusation, but to her, it was a gunshot. Her smile, fixed and painted, seemed to crack. Her hand stopped twisting the ring. She stared at him, her eyes wide with a flash of pure, unadulterated panic. She had thought he was a non-entity, a ghost. The ghost had just spoken. She recovered in an instant, letting out a brittle little laugh. "Richard, darling, so sentimental. It's just bricks and mortar. Now, if you'll all turn to page 12. But the damage was done. Margaret Ellison was looking at my father, then at Elaine, then back at my father, her expression sharp and calculating. She had seen the hit. She knew she'd struck a nerve, and she knew my father had just signaled why. The meeting broke up soon after. I left, making my excuses, my mind on fire. The fireplace is the soul of the house. He wasn't just warning her, he was warning me. She was getting desperate. She was planning to sell the house, to sell the evidence. I drove not home, but to a diner on the edge of town. I sat in a back booth, the smell of stale coffee and grease a welcome antidote to the cloying perfume of the Laurel Club. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in 3 years. Financial crimes, Blake. The voice was the same, no nonsense, tired, and sharp as a tack. "Nora, it's Katie Hoffman." A silence on the other end. Then, a sigh. "Hoffman, Jesus, I was wondering if you'd ever call. Silverline, right? I was in fraud back then. I read your file. You got screwed." "I did," I said, my throat tight. "And I think I'm in a different kind of trouble, a worse kind." "You're calling financial crimes, so it's not about your stepmother slapping you," she said. It wasn't a question. How did you know that?" "I'm a detective, and in this town, the Hoffmans are a full-time hobby. We hear things, the fragile daughter, the unfortunate breakdown. It's a neat narrative. So what's the real story?" I told her everything. The stroke, the POA, the Kindling Fund ledger, the photo, the Gallery West auctions, the Northgate Trust. I spoke for 10 minutes, my voice low and fast, the words tumbling out. Nora was silent. When I finished, I could hear her tapping a pen on her desk. "Okay," she said. "You have a hell of a case. The ledger, the photo. That's a conspiracy to defraud. The wire transfers Dylan described are the nail in the coffin. You bring me those scans, and I can get a warrant." "Good," I said, breathing a sigh of relief. "But," she cut in, her voice hard, "you have a problem, a big one. That NDA you signed with Silverline." "What? That has nothing to do with this. That was a corporate matter." "Was it? Or was it a mental breakdown? Because that's the story Elaine's been selling for 2 years. The second you file a complaint, her lawyer, Hale, right? The co-conspirator, is going to file a countersuit. He'll say this is a malicious prosecution. He'll say you're an unstable, vengeful woman. He'll use the Silverline NDA as proof that you have a history of stealing proprietary documents and misinterpreting financial data. He will paint you as a paranoid hysteric, and in court, that kind of mud sticks." The blood drained from my face. She was right. Elaine hadn't just been slandering me for fun. She had been building a preemptive defense. "So what do?" I whispered. "The documents are a fortress," Nora said, her voice softening just a little. "But you need a confession. You need something that ties her, in her own voice, to those documents. You need to get her to admit she knows about the Kindling Fund. Get her to admit she's moving the money. The documents show what happened. You need her to tell you why. A confession. Combined with that ledger? That's not a case. That's a guilty plea. Hale can't spin that." I thought for a moment. A confession. How could I get a woman who lies as she breathes to tell the truth? "She's a performer," I said, thinking aloud. "She lives for an audience." "Then give her one," Nora said, "and make damn sure you're recording." I hung up. Thursday, after 9, my father's deadline. He knew she was moving to sell the house. He was forcing a final move. I knew exactly what to do. I went to the finest stationery store in Brookvale and bought one. single, obscenely expensive card. It was thick cream stock, with a glittering, hand-painted border of silver leaves. I wrote out the invitation in my best script. Elaine, you are right. It's time for us to put the past behind us and move forward as a family. Please be my guest for a reconciliation dinner. Tomorrow evening, 9 o'clock. Just us. Let's finally talk. Katie. I drove home. I went to my room and found a small, silver-plated box. I placed the invitation inside. Then, I did something I'd never done. I went to the master wing. I walked past my father's closed study door and entered Elaine's dressing room. It was a temple of white carpet and mirrors. Her perfumes, dozens of them, sat on a glass tray, suffocating the air. Her jewelry was laid out. Her gowns hung in plastic bags, waiting for the next gala. On her vanity, a massive antique table with a 3-paneled mirror was her personal iPad and her phone. I placed the silver box right in the center, on top of her leather-bound planner. She couldn't miss it. I turned to leave, my heart pounding. My part in the trap set. I was in the hallway, halfway to the stairs, when I heard her voice. She was in the adjoining bedroom, the door slightly ajar. She was on the phone. Her voice was not the warm cello. It was the cold, flat blade I'd heard on the tape. "Victor, stop panicking," she snapped. "He's senile. That fireplace comment was nothing. A lucky guess." A pause. She was listening. "No," she said, her voice dropping to a low, vicious hiss. "He doesn't have the proof. It's all contained." Another pause. I could hear Victor's tinny, frantic voice from the receiver. "Fine," she said. "I'll handle the other problem. I'll handle her. She's poking around, but she's stupid. She's weak. She won't find anything." She laughed, a dry, ugly sound. "Don't be ridiculous. This house is a fortress. But, just in case, if she ever gets into that wall, if she opens the fireplace, we all burn." Thursday, 8:55 in the evening. I had set the stage. This was not a gala. It was an interrogation, and the room had to be perfect. I had chosen the small family dining room, not the great hall. It was intimate, paneled in dark, absorbing wood, a room designed to hold secrets. The table was small, round, set for only 3, or so it would appear. I used simple white china, my mother's, and plain linen napkins, no elaborate centerpieces, just low, warm candles that cast flickering, suggestive shadows. I wanted them to feel comfortable, to feel safe, right before the trap snapped shut. In the corner, a small, hidden speaker played a quiet, intricate Bach concerto, music to fill the silence, to make it seem civilized. My preparations had been precise. At 8:30, I'd gone to the great hall. I'd knelt on the hearth, my head and shoulders deep in the chimney. I'd pulled the heavy iron damper lever, not all the way, but to the exact midpoint I'd discovered. I listened. It created a faint, almost imperceptible whistle, a low, hollow hiss as the air was drawn up the flue. It was the exact acoustic signature, the faint, breathy background noise I'd heard on the autumn flame tape. If I was going to get a new confession, I wanted the audio to match. I wanted the room to be a perfect replica of her last betrayal. My phone, fully charged and already recording, was slipped into a tall, heavy brass vase on the mantel. The vase was positioned to look decorative, but it was aimed directly at the dining room table. Less than 15 feet away, it would catch every word. At 10 minutes to 9, my father appeared. He didn't come from his study. He came from the side door, as if he'd been for a walk in the frigid night air. He was composed, his face a neutral mask, but his eyes were alive. He didn't speak. He just walked up to me in the hall and pressed a small, dark blue velvet bag into my hand. It was surprisingly heavy. "The last piece," he said, his voice a low rumble. I opened the drawstring. Inside was not a key. It was a document, thick, heavy bond paper, folded in 3. I opened it. It was the original, durable power of attorney, the one my mother had insisted upon, drafted the year I turned 21. It was signed by Richard Hoffman, and as co-manager of the trust, it was signed by me, Katie Hoffman. It was notarized, dated, and sealed, and it was active. It had never been superseded, because the document Elaine had tried to file during his illness had been an illegal forgery. This was the original. This was the law. Victor Hale, he told me this was lost in the archive, I whispered, staring at my own, younger signature. Victor has been a fool for a very long time, my father said. He forgot that I keep my own archives. Put it away. She's here. He didn't wait for a reply. He simply walked into the dining room, took his seat at the table, and calmly unfolded his napkin. The frail patriarch, waiting for his dinner. I slipped the document into my pocket, the stiff paper a rectangular shield against my hip. The front door opened. Elaine did not ring the bell. She let herself in, as she always did, as if announcing her ownership of the very air. She swept into the dining room, a vision in shimmering silver. Her dress was sleeveless, her hair was up, and the pearl ring was on full display. She was dressed for a conquest, not a reconciliation. Her eyes, bright and hard, took in the scene, the simple table, the candles, my father sitting placidly. She was assessing the trap. "Katie, darling," she said, her voice a cascade of warm honey. She glided over and kissed the air near my cheek. "This is lovely, so simple, so It was not a compliment. "Elaine," I said, my voice steady. "Thank you for coming. Please, sit." "Richard," she said, turning to him, her smile wattage increasing. "You're looking rested." My father just nodded, his gaze distant. She took her seat. She looked at the single, empty place setting. "I thought you said, just us?" she asked, a knife edge of suspicion in her voice. "Are we expecting Dylan?" "No," I said. The doorbell rang, loud and clear. Elaine's head snapped toward the door. Her smile vanished. "Who is that?" "A guest," I said. "I thought, since we were discussing family and the future, it would be good to have a neutral perspective." I walked to the door. Margaret Ellison stood on the porch, wrapped in a dark cashmere coat, her expression stern and curious. She had accepted my invitation, which I delivered an hour ago, citing a sudden urgent matter regarding the Foundation's governance. "Margaret," I said, opening the door wide, "thank you so much for coming on such short notice." "Katie," she said, stepping inside, her sharp eyes taking in everything. "You said it was an emergency." I led her into the dining room. Elaine had stood up. Her face was white. The sight of Margaret Ellison, her primary donor, her social validation, her judge, at this table was a blow she had not anticipated. "Margaret," Elaine said, her voice straining to recover its warmth. What a surprise. Are you joining us for dinner?" "Hello, Elaine. Richard," Margaret said, her gaze fixed on Elaine's panicked expression. "Katie invited me. She said there was a discrepancy in the Foundation's future. I'm here as the chairwoman." "Elaine, please sit," I said, my voice calm. I pulled out the chair for Margaret, the one I had deliberately placed. It was the chair closest to the great hall, the one with a clear view of the fireplace. "Margaret, please, right here. It's the warmest seat in the house." Elaine sat down, her movements stiff. The performance had shattered. This was not a reconciliation. This was an ambush. Lorna, whom I had instructed earlier, appeared with a bottle of water and poured for Margaret. Lorna's face was as impassive as stone. She met my eyes, nodded once, and disappeared. The room was silent, save for the sound of Bach and the faint, high-pitched hiss of the fireplace flue. Elaine, ever the predator, recovered first. She picked up her water glass, her pearl ring flashing in the candlelight. She decided to attack. "Well," she said, forcing a light, tinkling laugh, "this is certainly dramatic. Katie, what is this about? Are you having another one of your episodes?" dragging poor Margaret out on a Thursday night? I'm perfectly fine, Elaine, Margaret said, her voice like ice. I am here to ensure the foundation I support is stable. Now, Katie, what is this discrepancy? It's about the house, I said. Elaine's eyes narrowed. I understand, I continued, that you're planning to sell the estate, to trim the fat. Elaine relaxed, a small, smug smile touching her lips. She thought this was it, a childish, sentimental plea. Yes, it's a hard decision, but a necessary one. The foundation needs to be liquid. Sometimes, in business, one has to be creative to keep the cash flow moving. Sentimentality doesn't pay the bills. She looked at Margaret, seeking an ally in their shared world of ruthless finance. That was the line. That was the cue. Creative, I said. I let the word hang in the air. What kind of creative, Elaine? I reached into the bag at my feet, the one I'd brought in from the library. I pulled out the heavy, leather-bound ledger. I placed it on the table in the space between our plates. The sound was a dull, heavy thud that made the silverware jump. The gold-embossed title was facing her, gleaming in the candlelight. Kindling Fund. Elaine stopped breathing. Her eyes shot from the book to my face, to Margaret, and then to my father, who was still just watching, his hands folded. She didn't know what was in the book. She only knew it was his, and that it had that name, a name that should not exist outside of a secret account. What? What is that? She said, her voice a dry, unfamiliar croak. This, I said, tapping the cover. This is your creativity, all of it. The Northgate Trust, the wires to Gallery West, the money you stole from the foundation, the money you stole from him. Margaret Ellison leaned forward, her eyes flashing. Elaine stared at the book. Her face was a storm of fear, calculation, and pure, unadulterated rage. She was trapped, and she knew it. She looked at Margaret, then at me. Her hand, the one with the ring, was gripping the table so hard her knuckles were white. She forced another laugh, this one high and brittle. I have no idea what you're talking about. This is absurd. You've forged this. You're insane. This thing, she gestured at the book, is garbage. It means nothing. She reached for the ledger, her silver-painted nails like claws, intending to snatch it. Elaine. Those are Hoffman Holdings documents. What doesn't belong in this house? She said, her eyes flashing toward the fireplace in the great hall. Gets swallowed by the fireplace. You should know that. She was threatening to burn it. She was confessing, in front of her witness, that her solution was destruction. The ledger was halfway across the table. My hand was still on it. Her hand was moving toward it. Leave it there. The voice cut through the room, through the music, through the tension. It was not loud. It was not a request. It was an iron command. We all froze. My father had not moved. He was still seated, his hands still folded, but his head was up, and his eyes were fixed on his wife. The frail, confused, semi-retired man was gone. In his place was Richard Hoffman, the CEO, the man who had built an empire, the man who had set this entire trap, and the man who had just taken his finger off the trigger. The room was completely, totally silent. Even Bach had stopped. Elaine's hand hovered, trembling, over the ledger. She looked at her husband, and for the first time in my life, I saw pure, undiluted fear in her eyes. She had just realized, far too late, that she had never been the predator. She had always been the prey. My father's command hung in the air, absolute and final. Elaine's hand, the one in the silver dress, remained frozen over the ledger, a tableau of her own greed. She didn't dare touch it. She didn't dare pull away. You're right, Elaine, I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the silence. We should be clear about what belongs in this house. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing past the cold brass key. I pulled out the folded document my father had given me, the original power of attorney. But this, I said, is only one part of the record. From the bag at my feet, I pulled out a second document. This one was a newer, thinner stack of papers. It was the copy of the forged POA that Victor Hale had tried to file, the one Dylan had guiltily retrieved a copy of for me earlier that day. I placed them side by side on the polished wood, pushing them toward Margaret. I believe you'll recognize the format, Margaret, I said. 2 versions of the Hoffman Family Trust's durable power of attorney. Margaret, a woman who had spent 30 years on boards, didn't hesitate. She put on a pair of slim reading glasses, picked up the first document, then the second. The room was silent, save for the rustle of heavy bond paper. She scanned them, her eyes flicking back and forth, her face, already stern, hardened into granite. "The dates," she said, her voice flat. She looked up, not at me, but straight at Elaine. "The original, signed by you, Richard, and you, Katie, is dated on Katie's 21st birthday. The second one," she tapped the forgery with a manicured nail, "is dated October 15th, 6 months ago, the day after Richard was admitted to the spa in Arizona." She looked back at Elaine. "This second version," Margaret said, her voice dangerously quiet, "removes Katie entirely and gives you, Elaine, sole, unrestricted financial control. Why would Richard sign this?" Elaine saw the opening, the flaw in the attack. She saw an opportunity for her narrative. She lunged at it. "Because he wasn't well," she cried, her voice suddenly cracking with a perfect, theatrical sob. She reached a hand toward my father, a gesture of desperate, wifely concern. "Richard, darling, you don't remember, do you? You were so confused after the stroke, the memory loss. The doctors said." She turned back to Margaret, her eyes brimming with manufactured tears. "He was signing papers he didn't understand. He was paranoid. He thought everyone was against him." She shot a venomous look at me. "She took advantage of his illness. She brought him this fantasy." She gestured to the kindling fund ledger. "And he believed her. He's sick, Margaret, and she," her voice dropped to a whisper of profound betrayal, "is trying to have him declared incompetent." It was a brilliant move, a perfect pivot. She had turned my accusation into her defense. I was the unstable one, the fragile daughter, poisoning her frail father against his loving wife. I watched her performance, the trembling lip, the tear she held, perfectly, in the corner of her eye, refusing to let it drop and ruin her makeup. The room waited. Margaret looked at my father, her face a mask of clinical inquiry. She was waiting for his response. My father, who had been silent, slowly raised his eyes. He looked at Elaine, his gaze not angry but almost analytical, as if studying a flawed piece of code. "It's true," he said, his voice calm and even. "I do forget things." Elaine's expression flickered with triumph. "I forget," he continued, his voice resonating in the quiet room. "The names of new board members. I forget what I ate for breakfast, but I have never, not for 1 second, forgotten my daughter." The words landed, each one a precise, devastating blow. He had not defended himself. He had validated me. The entire foundation of Elaine's story, that I was the unstable, peripheral child, crumbled. Elaine's face went slack. The tears instantly dried. The mask was gone. "You," she hissed at him, her voice a low snarl. "You senile old fool! You're protecting her?" "No," I said, cutting in. "He's protecting the foundation." I placed my hand on the kindling fund ledger. "You're right, Margaret. The POA forgery is just the motive. This," I tapped the leather, "is the crime?" I didn't need to open the book. I had memorized the scans. I had been a compliance officer. This was my report. "On October 17th, I said, my voice clear and cold. 2 days after that forged document was signed, Elaine made the first transfer, $112,000, from the Hoffman Foundation's main account to a shell corporation, the Northgate Trust. Dylan, I'm sure you remember that wire." Elaine looked as if I had slapped her. On November 4th, I continued, a check for $80,000 was written to Gallery West Auctions. The memo line read, Gala expenses. The gala, as we all know, was last week. That money was not for expenses. It was a down payment on a collection of pre-Columbian gold artifacts. Margaret, who also sat on the board of the City Museum, sucked in a sharp breath. Antique gold, she whispered, her eyes wide. That's trafficking. On November 10th, a wire for $30,000 to a private account, tagged legal consultation, Victor Hale's personal retainer, I assume, on top of the Foundation's official one. 2 weeks ago, $50,000, cash withdrawal, donor outreach, and just yesterday, the $100,000 you tried to force Dylan to sign, all in all. I looked at Elaine, my voice dropping. Over $500,000, stolen, in 6 months? Elaine began to laugh. It was not a laugh of amusement. It was a dry, ugly, cracking sound, like stones breaking. You have no proof that book, she spat, is a fantasy. It's his word, a sick old man, against mine. But her hand, her right hand, was on the table, and she was twisting the pearl ring, twisting. Her knuckles were white. She was turning it so hard, so fast, grinding it against her own finger. A tiny, bright bead of blood welled up from under the pearl, where the setting had cut into her skin. I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, just loud enough for the recorder on the mantel. You're right, Elaine. It's just a book, just a lot of numbers. But tell me, do you remember the name? I paused. She stared at me, her eyes wild. Do you remember the name? I said, enunciating every syllable. Kindling Fund? That was the word, the code, the one name that only she, my father, and now I could possibly know. It wasn't just the name of the ledger, it was the name of the secret account she and Victor had created. She froze. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The blood from her finger dripped onto the white linen napkin. She stared at the ledger, her face a mask of pure, uncomprehending horror. She had been so careful. She had been so clever. And that one, single, private name had just been spoken aloud at her dinner table, in front of Margaret Ellison. How? She whispered, her voice a strangled rasp. How did you? She lost control. The mask of the civilized, cold-blooded wife didn't just crack, it exploded. You! She shrieked, her voice rising to a glass-shattering pitch. She shoved her chair back, the legs scraping violently on the wood floor. You little bitch! You dug this up! You went through his things! Elaine, my father said, his voice a sharp warning. Shut up! She screamed at him. You and your pathetic, sentimental traps, your fireplace. The dining room door opened, quietly. Dylan Mark stepped in, his face gray with terror, but his jaw set. Behind him, her back straight and her hands clasped, was Lorna. Dylan! Elaine shrieked, rounding on him. What are you doing here? Get out! He's here, I said. As a witness, he was invited. By me, my father said, his voice flat. Dylan looked at Elaine, and for the first time, his gaze didn't waver. I have the wire reports. Elaine, the ones you had me sign. I have the emails. I gave them to Katie. Elaine's head snapped back to me. Her chest was heaving. She was trapped. The walls closing in. A book. Emails from a terrified, weak little man, she sneered, her voice dripping with contempt. It's all circumstantial. It's he said, she said, it's nothing. I agree, I said. A book isn't enough. Emails aren't enough. We need a primary source. I reached over to the small sideboard behind me. I pressed the play button on the old Tascam cassette deck I had placed there an hour ago. A hiss, a click, and then a voice. It has to be done, Victor. I don't care what he thinks. Elaine's cold, flat, and impatient. Elaine stumbled back, her hand flying to her throat as if to stop her own voice from escaping the machine. What? No. What is that? He just had a stroke. Victor, we amend the durable power of attorney. Full financial control. Now. Margaret Ellison's face was pale. She looked at Richard, at his quiet dignity, and then at the machine, her eyes blazing with a cold fury. Then, my father's voice, slurred and thick from the tape. If you touch it again, I will open the fireplace. Elaine's own brittle laugh. What? Richard? You're delirious. You're talking nonsense. The tape clicked, the audio clear in the stunned, silent room. Margaret Ellison didn't look at any of us. She calmly, quietly, reached into her purse. She pulled out her cell phone. She tapped the screen, and then she placed the phone flat on the table, right next to the kindling fund ledger. She pressed the speakerphone button. A new voice, female, sharp, and all business, filled the room. Inspector Blake, financial crimes. This line is recorded. Who am I speaking with? Nora, Margaret said, her voice like steel. It's Margaret Ellison. I'm at the Hoffman residence. I have you on speakerphone with Richard, Katie, and Elaine Hoffman. Elaine looked at the phone, at the tape player, at me. It was over. The trap was sprung, and she was in it. It was too much. Her rage, her humiliation, her fear. It all coalesced into one, final, violent impulse. She lunged, not at my father, not at the machine. At me. Her hand, the one with the ring, the one still beaded with blood, flew up, aimed at the same cheek she had struck just nights before. It was a reflexive, primal act of silencing. I didn't flinch. I didn't brace for the impact. I didn't even blink. I just looked at her. My stillness, my absolute lack of fear, stopped her hand mid-air. It faltered, trembling, 6 inches from my face. She had been counting on my terror. It was the one weapon she'd always had, and it was gone. She stared into my eyes and saw, not her victim, but her replacement. She saw the new head of the house. Her arm dropped, useless, to her side. She was breathing in harsh, ragged gasps. Nora, I said, my voice perfectly level, my eyes never leaving Elaine's. I believe you have everything you need. The silence in the room was a living, breathing thing. Elaine's hand was still frozen in the air. Her face a mask of disbelief and fury. My voice, calm and clear, was still echoing. I believe you have everything you need. Nora's voice, crackling from the speakerphone on the table, was the only thing that moved. Understood. Ms. Ellison, I'm dispatching a car. Do not let her leave. But my father was looking at me. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were fixed on mine. He nodded. Once. Katie, he said, and his voice cut through the paralysis. Open the fireplace. It was not a request. It was the final move in a game I hadn't understood we were playing. Elaine's head snapped toward him, her expression a mix of confusion and fresh terror. What? What more? What other senile... I didn't wait for her to finish. I stood, my chair scraping back. I walked past the dinner table, past Margaret, who was watching with a pale, intense focus. I walked into the great hall. I knelt on the cold hearthstone. My father's words, trust the fireplace, Lorna's, the loose stone. I pressed the bottom left corner of the brick, the one I had found just nights before. The seam, invisible to any but the searching eye, opened. The brick tilted inward. Behind me, I heard Elaine's strangled gasp. What? What is that? I reached into the dark void. My fingers found the small, ornate keyhole. I slid the brass key from my pocket. The key Lorna had given me, the key that had started it all. I slid it into the lock. A soft snick. I pulled. The heavy steel box, disguised as a common brick, slid out into my hands. I stood up, holding the box. It felt heavier than before. I walked back to the dining table. I placed it, with a heavy, definitive thud, right next to the kindling fund ledger, right next to Margaret's phone, which was still live, broadcasting the entire scene to the financial crimes unit. "This," I said, "is the rest of it." I lifted the lid. The Autumn Flame cassette tape was there, a relic of a past defense, but it wasn't alone. Beneath it lay a small, black, modern SD memory card, and on top of that, another single, folded piece of my father's stationery. I picked up the note, I unfolded it, I read it, my voice clear and loud for the room, for the phone, for everyone. "If I walk away, follow the ash." I looked at my father, the ashy napkin, his retreat. Follow the ash. It wasn't a surrender, it was a breadcrumb. "More games," Elaine shrieked, her voice cracking. "More of your pathetic, cryptic nonsense." "It's not a game, Elaine," my father said, his voice a low, cold rumble. "It's an archive." I took the memory card. I reached into my bag and pulled out my laptop. I sat down, opened it, and slid the card into the adapter. The screen lit up my face. "What's on the card, Katie?" Nora's voice asked, sharp and insistent from the phone. "I think," I said, my fingers clicking on the trackpad. "It's the minutes from every meeting Elaine held without the board." A single folder appeared. It was labeled Hearthstone. I opened it. The folder was full, not of documents. It was filled with audio files, hundreds of them, meticulously dated, stretching back not 6 months, but 5 years. Elaine and Victor. Phone. Elaine and art dealer. Elaine. Northgate call. My blood ran cold. I looked at my father. He was watching me. I clicked on a file from 3 days ago, the day before the Laurel Club meeting. Elaine's voice, not the tape hiss of the Autumn Flame, but a crystal-clear, high-fidelity digital recording, filled the room. And so I told Margaret it was for acquisitions. She's an old fool. She'll believe anything as long as it sounds exclusive. The gold is secure. The auction is private. By the time Richard's estate is fully liquidated, the kindling fund will be in a vault in Zurich and Victor, will be in a villa in Greece. He's too weak to stop it, and that pathetic, fragile daughter of his is too stupid to even see it. A click, I stopped the recording. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a tomb. Elaine was staring at the laptop, her face chalk white, her mouth open in a silent scream. She looked at the fireplace. She looked at my father. And she finally understood. "Where?" she whispered, her voice a dead, hollow rasp. "Where did you... how?" "The fireplace. Elaine," my father said. He stood up, and for the first time, he did not look frail. He looked tall. He looked like the man who had built Hoffman Holdings from nothing. "You were always so theatrical," he said, his voice conversational, as if explaining a business deal. "You loved to pace in the great hall. You loved to take your calls by the fire, where you felt powerful. You loved my study. You thought you were so clever." He walked, slowly, toward the fireplace. "This house was built in 1905. It's full of old, hollow spaces, flues that go nowhere, servants' bells that haven't been used in a century, a perfect, natural wiring system." He gestured to the damper chain, the one I had used to open the second safe. "The microphone is in the damper. It's been there for 10 years, ever since I first suspected your creative accounting, when you were just skimming a few thousand off the gala funds." He turned to me. "Every time I walked away from you two, every time I left the room when you were fighting, every time I went to my study to be alone, I wasn't retreating. Katie, I was going to the library, the room next to the study, and I was flipping a switch." The truth of it hit me like a physical blow. His abandonment, his silence, every retreat I had taken as a wound, as a betrayal, had been a tactical maneuver. "I pretended to be weak," he said, his voice turning back to the room, to Margaret, to the phone. "After the stroke, it was easy. She wanted a fool. She needed me to be a senile, confused old man so her forgery would hold. So I gave her one. I let her. I let her get arrogant. I let her dig her own grave, right here, in my house. Why? I whispered. The word was out before I could stop it. It wasn't for the police. It was for me. Why let it go on? Why let me? His eyes met mine, and the iron mask of the CEO cracked. I saw my father. Because of Silverline, he said, his voice rough. I saw what they did to you, the NDAs, the whispers, the way they destroyed your reputation, how they painted you as unstable, paranoid, fragile. I knew that if I, a man recovering from a stroke, filed a lawsuit against my loving, supportive wife, Victor Hale would do the exact same thing to me. He would have me declared incompetent. It would be a long, ugly public war, and the foundation, our name, would be destroyed in the crossfire. It would be my word against hers. He took a step toward me. So I waited. I waited for her to get so confident in her own lies that she would leave a trail. And I waited for you. For me? For you to be strong enough, he said. For you to be the investigator I raised you to be. I couldn't give you the evidence. Katie, it would have been tainted. The ramblings of a sick old man. You had to find it. You had to follow the ash. You had to build the case. You had to be the one to open the fireplace. The confession settled over the room. The years of pain, of loneliness, of feeling unseen. It had all been a strategy. A long, cold, terrible, brilliant strategy. Illegal. Elaine finally found her voice. It was a high, desperate, animal shriek. That is illegal. You cannot record me. It's inadmissible. It's a crime. I'll have you arrested. I'll have you both arrested. She was screaming at the phone, at Nora, her last, desperate hope. Inspector, did you hear that? He admitted it. He admitted to a crime. The speakerphone crackled. Nora's voice was dry, cold, and utterly unimpressed. Mrs. Hoffman, I'm in Connecticut. Are you? What? Yes, of course. Then I suggest you look up Connecticut General Statutes. Title 52, Section 570D. Connecticut is a one-party consent state. As Mr. Hoffman was a party to the conversation, in his own house, recording what was being said in his own house, his consent was the only one required. A dead, profound, and final silence. What's more, Nora continued, her voice like a hammer striking an anvil, you're on a recorded line with a police officer, Mrs. Hoffman, and for the last 5 minutes, you have been screaming your own confession. Between the kindling fund ledger, the wiretaps, and your own big mouth, frankly, my job is done. My father looked at me. The CEO was gone. It was just my dad. His eyes were filled with a decade of apology. Katie, he said, his voice rough. I am sorry. I am so sorry. I let you believe I was on the side of silence. I let you believe you were alone. I looked back at him, at this man, my father, who had been a fortress of secrets. I looked at the ledger, at the autumn flame tape, at the laptop screen, filled with 5 years of his wife's treachery. We were never on the side of silence, I said, and my voice was steady. We were just waiting. I turned to my laptop. The screen was bright. Nora, I said, my fingers flying across the keys. I'm opening a secure email. I'm attaching the kindling fund scans, and I'm attaching the entire Hearthstone folder. The files are large. It might take a minute. I hit send, the final move, the truth, digitized and undeniable, flying through the air to the hands of the law. The morning did not begin. It detonated. By 8:30, Margaret Ellison, acting with the swift, brutal efficiency that had made her a legend, had convened an emergency session of the Hoffman Holdings Board. It was held in the main conference room, a glass and steel box on the 20th floor, high above the city, a room that left no space for shadows. My father and I sat at the table. He was not the frail man from the night before. He was Richard Hoffman, the CEO, dressed in a dark, severe suit, his face carved from granite. I sat to his right, with my laptop, the kindling fund scans, and the Hearthstone audio files. At 9 o'clock, the door opened. Inspector Nora Blake entered. She was not in uniform. She was in a rumpled gray pantsuit, looking exhausted but energized, like a predator who had finally caught a scent. She was flanked by two men in suits who looked like they lived on bad coffee and spreadsheets. They were from the Financial Crimes Unit. "Good morning," Nora said, her voice cutting through the polite, terrified silence of the board members Margaret had summoned. "As of 7:01 this morning, my office, in conjunction with the state prosecutor, has executed a warrant to search and seize all financial records of the Hoffman Foundation, the Northgate Trust, and all personal accounts of Mrs. Elaine Hoffman." One of her men placed a thick bound document in front of my father. "The data Ms. Hoffman provided last night," Nora continued, nodding at me, "was comprehensive. It's currently being corroborated. My team at the bank confirmed the wire transfers. They matched the Kindling Fund ledger to the dollar. My other team is currently at Gallery West Auctions. The owner, a Mr. Anza, is being surprisingly cooperative. He's already provided the original invoices for the pre-Columbian artifacts. They match the dates in the ledger. And the photo we have of him, Mrs. Hoffman, and..." The door to the conference room opened again. Victor Hale burst in, his face red, his expensive overcoat flapping. "This is an outrage. I am counsel for this corporation. You cannot be in here. This is privileged. You are all..." "Mr. Hale, sit down." Nora's voice was flat. "I will not. I am filing an injunction. This circus, is based on the fantasies of a..." He looked at me, his face contorting with rage. "A fragile woman, Victor?" I asked, my voice quiet. "A paranoid hysteric?" "We've been listening to your work. Mr. Hale," Nora said. She pulled a small digital recorder from her pocket. She didn't bother with the old Tascam. She had the digital file. She pressed play. Victor's own voice, rich and smooth, filled the $20 million boardroom. "Elaine, what you're suggesting is not just unethical, it's precarious." Victor stopped. His mouth remained open. The blood drained from his face, leaving a pasty gray mask. Nora fast-forwarded. She didn't need the whole thing. "We amend the durable power of attorney. Full financial control, now." Elaine's voice. Victor swayed. He gripped the back of a chair. That's taken out of context," he stammered. "Is it?" Nora said. "Or is this the context?" She signaled to the door. Dylan Marks entered, holding a stack of manila folders. He didn't look at Victor. He walked straight to Nora and placed the folders on the table. "These are the emails, Inspector," Dylan said, his voice shaking but clear. "The ones she sent, ordering me to sign the wire transfers, the ones with the promises of a promotion." Victor Hale looked at the emails. He looked at the Kindling Fund ledger on the table. He looked at my father, who was staring at him with a cold, profound disappointment that was worse than any hatred. Victor's legs gave out. He slumped into the chair, his hands covering his face. She pushed me. She said he was weak. She said it was simple, a simple restructuring. "You have about 30 seconds. Mr. Hale," Nora said, "to decide if you are a co-conspirator or a cooperating witness. I suggest you start talking. My associate will show you to an empty office." One of the suits gently, firmly, lifted Victor by the elbow. He went, a broken, shuffling man, his career of 30 years evaporating in a single, recorded moment. The door opened again. It was Lorna. She was holding a clear plastic evidence bag. "Inspector," Lorna said, her voice the same steady, respectful murmur she had always used. "You asked about burned documents. I was cleaning the hearth this morning, as I always do. This was pushed deep into the flue." Inside the bag was a charred, half-melted clump of paper, but the top right corner was intact, a heavy official stamp, a seal. "That," Nora said, taking the bag, Is the seal of the state prosecutor's office. A summons. Looks like someone has been burning official mail. She looked at the board. That's a federal offense. The room was silent. Margaret Ellison finally spoke. Richard. My father looked at her. This is your house, she said. Clean it. My father nodded. He took a single, heavy document from his briefcase. He signed it. His signature a sharp, definitive black line. He pushed it across the table to me. This, he said, his voice carrying through the room, reaffirms my daughter, Katie Hoffman, as the co-manager of the Hoffman Trust, with full and equal power, effective immediately. Her first act, he looked at me, will be her own. I took the pen. I pulled another document from my own bag, a suspension order. My first act, I said, is to move for the immediate and permanent suspension of Elaine Hoffman from all activities, duties, and associations with Hoffman Holdings and the Hoffman Foundation, pending criminal investigation. Margaret Ellison. I second the motion. All in favor, my father said. Every hand in the room went up. The final act took place not in the boardroom, but back at the house. Nora had called, saying the search was complete. Elaine had been there the whole time, confined to her room. When we arrived, the house was swarming. The press had been alerted, not by us, but by the fleet of unmarked police cars. News vans were parked at the end of our driveway, their satellite dishes aimed at us like weapons. We found Elaine in the great hall. She was not in handcuffs, yet she was standing by the cold fireplace, dressed in a silk robe, her pearl ring still on her finger. She looked small. It's over, Elaine, my father said. Nora stepped forward, holding a plastic evidence bag. Mrs. Hoffman, we're seizing all personal assets related to the fraudulent accounts. That includes this. She held the bag open. The ring, please. Elaine looked at the ring, the pearl, her symbol of power. No, she whispered. Take it off, Nora commanded. Slowly, her hands shaking. Elaine twisted the ring, the one she had ground into her own skin just last night. She pulled it off and dropped it into the bag. Nora sealed it. She held it up to the light from the window. Interesting, she murmured, looking at the band. The settings, they're not original, and the serial number on the inside, it's been filed down. Elaine looked at the ring in the bag, and a new, different kind of terror crossed her face. The ring wasn't just an asset, it was stolen. It was another, older, darker secret. Elaine Hoffman, Nora said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. You are under arrest for larceny, multiple counts of felony wire fraud, and conspiracy to defraud. The click of the handcuffs locking was the loudest sound the old house had ever heard. No, Elaine whispered, and as they led her toward the front door, toward the flashing lights of the news cameras waiting outside, her composure finally, completely, shattered. She saw me, standing by the stairs, watching. You! She shrieked, her voice a raw, tearing sound. She lunged, pulling against the officers. You did this. You unstable. You ruined everything. You ruined this family. The cameras were flashing, their lights flooding the hall, illuminating the scene. The reporters were shouting questions. My father stood beside me, his hand on my shoulder. I looked at the woman who had terrorized me, the woman in the silver dress, the woman who had called me weak, and I felt nothing, just quiet. No, Elaine, I said, my voice clear and strong, cutting through her screams. I took a step forward, into the blinding light of the cameras. I saved it. It was late, perhaps midnight, perhaps later. The circus had finally moved on. The last news van, hungry for one more photograph of the disgraced wife, had packed up and retreated down the long driveway. The house was dreadfully, profoundly silent. The great hall, which had been the stage for so much performance, was just a room again. Nora Blake sat, not on a chair, but on the edge of the stone hearth, her jacket off, her sleeves rolled up. She looked exhausted. but her eyes were sharp, victorious. My father stood by the mantel, his hands clasped behind his back, staring into the cold, dead ash. I was on the bottom step, the same step where he had found me crying just a few nights ago. It felt like a different lifetime, a different me. "The prosecutor's office has everything," Nora said, her voice echoing slightly in the high-ceilinged room. "The encrypted scans, the original ledger, Victor Hale's full, sobbing cooperation." She permitted herself a small, grim smile. "He gave up everything and everyone in exchange for a lesser charge. He was terrified." "And her?" I asked. The name felt foreign, a word from a language I no longer spoke. "Elaine?" Nora's voice was flat, all business. "Oh, she's finished. The DA is fast-tracking this. They aren't just hitting her with the embezzlement and the dozen counts of wire fraud. They're adding the assault charge." My hand, reflexively, went to my cheek. The bruise was a faint, ugly yellow now, almost gone. The slap?" "The slap," Nora confirmed. "And the attempted assault last night, Margaret Ellison, as it turns out, is a very, very credible witness. So is Dylan. So is Lorna. So is a high-fidelity digital recording of her screaming her intentions. They are going to bury her under the jail." A new silence settled, heavier this time. It was the silence of after, the structure of the last 10 years, the entire architecture of my life, had been demolished in less than 6 hours. My father finally spoke, his voice low, still aimed at the fireplace. "Tomorrow," he said, not looking at me. "The board will meet again. The real lawyers, our lawyers, will be there. The press. The press will want a new narrative." He turned, his eyes finding mine. The CEO was gone again, replaced by the man who had been a ghost for so long. "Tomorrow. Katie, what do you want the truth to look like?" What did I want it to look like? I thought of the lies, the house that smelled of cinnamon and morality, the whispers about my fragility, the way she had twisted my integrity at Silverline into a weapon against me. I stood up. I knew exactly what to do. I walked to the fireplace. "This," I said, "is where it lived." I went through the familiar, practiced motions. I pressed the bottom left corner of the sandstone brick. The hairline seam opened, the brick tilted inward. I reached into the void, my fingers finding the small, cold keyhole. I slid the brass key from my pocket, the key Lorna had given me, the key that had started everything. I turned it. A soft snick. The heavy steel box slid out into my hands. I carried it back to the hearth. I opened the lid. Inside, the kindling fund ledger rested, its leather cover dark and heavy. Beside it, the autumn flame cassette tape. I picked up the ledger. For a single, fleeting moment, I thought about tossing it into the hearth. I thought about striking a match and watching 10 years of her treachery, her secret accounts, her greed, turn into ash, the way she had tried to burn her own court summons. "An end," my father said, his voice quiet. He had read my mind. "No," I said, my fingers gripping the leather. I looked at the book. "This isn't an ending. This isn't garbage to be burned. This is a record." I placed the kindling fund ledger back inside the steel safe. I put the autumn flame tape next to it, a relic of a past battle. I closed the heavy lid. I slid the box back into the wall. I turned the key, locking it in. I tilted the brick. It clicked, flush and invisible. It was done. It was no longer a weapon. It was an archive, sealed and silent, part of the house's permanent, unchangeable foundation. Then, I took the original power of attorney from my laptop bag, the one with my name, signed in my own 21-year-old hand, side by side with his. I didn't hide it. I didn't file it. I unfolded it and placed it directly on the center of the heavy oak mantel, right where the ashy napkin had been, right where all the world could see it. It was open. It was public. It was the new, undisputed law of the house. "It's done," I said. "Good," Nora said, pushing herself up from the hearth, stretching her back. "My team is waiting outside. We're done here for—" A key in the front door. The sound was a violation. A loud, violent click of the tumblers. All three of us froze. The heavy oak door swung open, banging against the wall. Elaine stood there. It was impossible. She was supposed to be in a downtown holding cell, awaiting arraignment. But she was here. She wasn't in the silk robe. She was in a dark, severe suit. Her hair was pulled back. Her face was pale, but her eyes were two burning coals of fury. And she was not alone. A tall, thin man in an expensive but rumpled suit stood beside her, his hand on her elbow, a bulging briefcase in his other hand. "What in the hell is this?" Nora Blake stepped forward, her hand instinctively moving to her hip, a reflexive gesture, though she was off duty. "You are in police custody. You cannot be here." "Bail, Inspector," the thin man said, his voice a reedy, unpleasant sound. He stepped in front of Elaine, a temporary shield. "My name is Arthur Sims. I am Mrs. Hoffman's new counsel. She posted bond less than 30 minutes ago. Her release was expedited. She is still a private citizen, and this is her home." "This," my father said, his voice a low growl that vibrated from his chest, "is my home." "A legal gray area we can dispute later," Sims chirped, stepping into the hall and opening his briefcase. Elaine pushed past him. Her eyes were not on my father. They were not on Nora. They were on me. The hatred from last night was gone, replaced by a terrifying, desperate, new calculation. "Katie," she said, and her voice broke. It was the most masterful performance of her life. "Katie, darling, oh, thank God. You have to listen to me." She took a step, her hands outstretched. That monster. Victor. He poisoned me. He twisted everything. I was weak. I was grieving my father's death. I never understood the numbers. He told me it was creative. That was his word. My God, I just used a word. She was weeping, real, hot, streaming tears carving tracks down her pale cheeks. "Katie, this is a terrible mistake. This is a family matter. We can fix this. You and me, your father. He's not well. You know that. We can put it all back." She was begging. It was grotesque, repellent. "You're destroying your father," she whispered, taking another step. The press, it will kill him. It will kill the company. He's not strong enough for this." She looked at my father, her eyes pleading. "Richard, tell her to stop this madness. I'll go away. I'll go to Europe. I'll sign anything. Just call off the police. Call them off." I looked at Nora. Nora looked at me, her expression unreadable. I said nothing. I walked to the table where my bag was. I reached in and pulled out a single, stapled sheaf of papers. Nora had drafted it in the 30 minutes before she arrived, a just-in-case measure, a final, definitive move. I walked back to Elaine. I didn't speak. I just held out the papers. Her tears stopped, instantly, as if a faucet had been turned off. What is that?" "It's a full confession," Nora said, her voice flat. "It details the conspiracy to defraud, the dates of the wire transfers, the falsification of the power of attorney, and the attempted and witnessed assault. It waives all rights to appeal. You sign it, and the DA might take the assault charge off the table. You don't, and we go for all of it, and we add witness tampering." The mask of the grieving wife evaporated. The cold, hard, calculating predator was back. Elaine let out a short, sharp laugh. It was the ugliest sound I had ever heard. "A confession?" she sneered. She turned to her new lawyer, who had been watching with a nervous frown. "Arthur." "Ah, yes," the lawyer said, snapping to attention. He pulled a single, crisp document from his own briefcase. This is what we wanted to discuss." He held it out, not to Nora, but to me. "It's a non-disclosure agreement, signed by your daughter, Katie Hoffman, Upon her termination from Silverline Industries, an agreement that stipulates she cannot discuss proprietary information, financial data, or internal corporate structures, an agreement she has now, by her own admission to the police, violated, by claiming a pattern of behavior. Elaine smiled, a real smile, all teeth. You see, Katie, you're not just an unstable, paranoid woman, you're a criminal. You broke your contract. The Silverline case? That's a $50 million civil suit. Easy. You, your father, this entire company, you'll be buried in lawsuits for a decade. She leaned in, her voice a triumphant hiss. You think your Fireplace recordings are clever? They're nothing. This is a contract. This is real. Now. Tear up that pathetic confession, or I will destroy what's left of your life. I'll take this house. I'll take your name. I'll take everything. It was a good move. It was her last move. I looked at her. I looked at the paper. I looked at Nora, who was watching me, waiting. The NDA? I said. Yes, the NDA, she spat. The one I signed 3 years ago, I said. The one that proves I was fired for instability after reporting a safety violation. Yes, that one. It's a good document, I said, which is why I submitted it myself. Elaine's smile faltered. What? To Inspector Blake, last night, with the first batch of files, I said. It's Exhibit D, part of the harassment and defamation claim. Proof of a long-term, calculated campaign to discredit me as a witness. It's the why. It's the how. It's the reason you thought you could get away with calling me fragile. It's not a defense. Elaine, it's the motive for your slander. You just confess to it, again. Arthur Sims, the reedy lawyer, froze. He looked at his own document. He looked at me. He looked at Nora. And he slowly, quietly, began sliding his papers back into his briefcase. He was done. Elaine looked at him, at her last, expensive hope. Arthur? He just shook his head, avoiding her eyes. Elaine, my father said, and his voice was a wall of iron. He stepped forward, moving to stand between me and her. He was no longer her husband, no longer her victim. He was a father protecting his child. This house is no longer your stage. The performance is over. She stared at him, at the man she thought she had broken. She looked at me, the daughter she thought was fragile. She looked at the confession in my hand. Her shoulders, for the first time, slumped, not in performance, but in true, absolute, bone-deep defeat. She snatched the papers from my hand. She didn't read them. She ripped the pen from her lawyer's pocket and signed the last page. Her signature a violent, angry slash of black ink. She threw the papers on the floor at my feet. Nora Blake stepped forward. Elaine Hoffman, she said, her voice official. You are, again, under arrest. Nora didn't cuff her in the front this time. She pulled Elaine's hands behind her back, and the click-click of the metal biting into her wrists echoed in the silent hall. Elaine didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't say a word. She just deflated. I watched them lead her out. The lawyer, Sims, just melted away into the night, a bad smell dissipating. Nora paused at the door. She looked at me. Ms. Hoffman? Mr. Hoffman. She nodded, a single, sharp sign of respect, and then she was gone. The door closed. The red and blue lights, which had been flashing through the windows, pulled away. The sound of sirens, faint, then fading, drifted into the night. I stood there, in the center of the great hall. I bent down and picked up the confession. The ink was still wet. My eyes were dry. I realized I hadn't cried, not once, not since that first night. I walked to the fireplace. I looked at the cold, dead ash. I closed the heavy brass and iron screen. I closed the glass doors. And then, I reached up and turned the heavy iron flue chime, closing the vent, the faint hiss of the night air. The last whisper of the house's secrets was gone. From now on, I whispered to the cold glass, only truth, The fire was out. The last of the embers died, leaving only the dark. I felt a warmth at my side. My father. He was standing next to me. He didn't say anything. He just reached out and took my hand. His grip was strong, calloused. It was the first time in my life I could remember him holding my hand. And he wasn't pulling me along. He was standing with me. He wasn't turning away. I looked at the front door, the one she had violated. I walked over to it. I opened it wide. A blast of freezing, clean November air surged into the hall. It was sharp and clean, smelling of pine and snow. It swirled around my feet, catching the fine, invisible particles of ash on the floor, the remnants of her burned letters, the memory of her presence. It whipped them up, and in a single, powerful gust, it carried them out into the dark, clean night. Elaine was gone, a prisoner in a car, moving further and further away. The documents were safe. The confession was in my hand. The great hall was silent. It was no longer a stage. It was no longer a prison. It was not a place of pain. It was just a room, quiet and at peace, filled with the bright, cold light of justice, finally lit. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'm curious, where are you listening from? Let us all know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please subscribe to Lila Revenge Stories, like this video, and give it an extra boost by hitting the hype button so more people can hear this story.